want to get accomplished, right? So now, for the purposes of what we're going to talk about today, for the next, say, 5 to 10 minutes, you have a wheelbarrow, and you're taking pumpkins, over to your trebuchet. So you're taking them from the field to the trebuchet. Every trip you take with your wheelbarrow, you can fit 17 pumpkin points in your wheelbarrow. What is that?
That is your sprint, your iteration.
Velocity.
Velocity. Awesome. All right, your velocity. 17 pumpkin points per trip. That's your velocity. So you look at the entire, view of all 1,000 pumpkin points. You're making 17 pumpkin points per trip. That's your velocity. You do an average, and you say it's going to take me about 60 iterations to get through this entire field of pumpkin points, right? So 60 sprints to go. If you do 4 iterations or 4 sprints per release, right, you're going to have, what's the math there? 15. You're going to have 15 releases to get through all of your pumpkin points. So as you get one of the key takeaways from this is you first make a guess to say, oh, well, it looks like this is 1,000 pumpkin points in this field. I'm going to go ahead and get started, right? I'm going to do 17 pumpkin points for each trip that I take to the trebuchet. As you get closer to clearing that field out, you get more and more accurate as to how long you have left to go, right? So maybe it's not going to take 60 sprints because as you start to go through this, you maybe get a little bit better and you find it's going to take 56 sprints. But you get more accurate in your forecasting once you get to the end, right? And that's a lot of the estimation stuff that we talked about yesterday afternoon. In moving that dot around to try to stay on the trend line in terms of overall project spend versus amount of work completed, which we'll also talk about later this morning, okay? All right, so let's ask a couple of questions here. You guys look like you're ready to roll with some questions. How do you get better with time in terms of getting the pumpkin points to the trebuchet? And I'm thinking of 3 ways. How do you get more efficient?
Recording the information.
Recording the information.
Using the right tools.
Using prior experience.
Using experience. Elaborate on experience.
Using your prior deployed projects and their lessons learned to your new Agile project.
Could be, but I'm thinking pure pumpkins and wheelbarrows at the moment.
Oh boy. Okay. I've never checked a pumpkin before. So.
Improving your technique. What do you mean?
Learning how to carry more pumpkins, perhaps no lower.
There you go. Perfect. So you figure if you take a bunch of trips and you can fit 17 pumpkin points, you're going to get pretty good at identifying how maybe to arrange those pumpkins or pick the right ones where maybe you can get 18 or 19 pumpkin points in a wheelbarrow. But are you ever going to get 30? Probably not. Wheelbarrow's just not big enough. But that was one of the answers. There's 2 more. No, no more cards this morning. There will be a different exercise right after metrics.
A bigger card?
Through retrospective meetings, we can identify where we can improve, where we can.
Sure.
You can look to increase the size of your wheelbarrow.
You get a bigger wheelbarrow, right? You get a huge wheelbarrow that you can carry. That's option number 2. What's option number 3?
More people.
Huh?
More resources.
Make a faster trip? Okay.
Yeah, that's.
I'm not going to count that one. But yes.
More resources pushing the wheelbarrow?
Huh?
More
resources.
More resources. What do you mean?
Like more people to push the wheelbarrow.
More people or more what?
More wheelbarrows.
More wheelbarrows.
Yeah,
You get another
wheelbarrows.
wheelbarrow. So those are the 3, right? You're going to get a little bit more efficient with time in terms of organizing your pumpkin points. You get a bigger wheelbarrow or you get another wheelbarrow, right? What's going to happen to you if you get a much bigger wheelbarrow? You won't be able to push it. You won't be able to push it or you'll be slow, right? That same thought process, that metaphor, translates very well to an Agile world. If you just, one of the knee-jerk reactions of our leadership is, oh, you're running behind, oh, I'm trying to give you a bunch more work, here's a bunch more people, right? That's very similar to the larger wheelbarrow. They dump in a bunch of new people that you're not familiar with. You're going to move slower. You're going to start tripping over each other. You might be duplicating work and not realize it because you're not aware of what everybody else is doing. So that metaphor is very relevant in an Agile world, that Scrum teams are not scalable by just jamming a bunch more people into an existing Scrum team. Scrum teams are scalable by adding another Scrum team. Just like if we had another wheelbarrow and another person, we could be twice as effective probably. Make sense?
Right.
To an extent though, right? I mean, at some point, you can't just add more people and get more done. Depending on where you're working.
Well, that's the whole you can't have 9 women have a baby in 1 month type thing. But if you're structured in your rollout and you keep scaling and creating scrum teams, I've seen situations where there are 10 or 15 scrum teams working on one product, and it works.
Yeah, I guess it depends on the application.
Yeah, I'm sure it does.
You're still looking at your 7 plus or minus 2.
7 plus or minus 2 in each scrum team.
Effective number.
Right. Right. So in today's world, I mean, it's not significantly different. What's the difference between having 300, 400 people work on an application versus 40 scrum teams? It's still 400 people. Right? Now you're just forced to figure out how you're going to split that work up logically. All right, anyway. So we already talked a little bit about predictability. You're going to get better in your forecasting as you get closer to the end. We talked about how release and iteration planning are impacted, where you might have 15 releases and they're simply time boxes. What do you do if your velocity is 17 pumpkin points per iteration? What do you do with your 21-point pumpkin?
You have to cut it.
You got to cut it, right? You got to split it in half so that you can essentially have it fit in your wheelbarrow so that you can carry, right? Excellent. All right. Any questions on this before we move to my actual metrics? All right. So the next piece that we're going to look at are the metrics that I had with my Scrum team now probably almost 2 years ago at this point. But I've intentionally pulled metrics that we saw early on in our life, in our overall Agile transformation. So these metrics, for the most part, are not ideal. There's an issue with all of them. So as we go through, you're going to notice that I'm going to explain to you how we're getting there and what they mean and how we use that information. So feel free as we go through, you can make fun of my metrics. We're going to talk about 5 of them. Velocity, burn down, sprint burn down, story or release, whatever, burn up, defect density, and budget. Budget is that trend line that I talked about yesterday. All right, ready? You ready for velocity? How many of you have used Rally before? Joe raised his hand. Thanks, Joe. All right. So this metric here is pulled right out of Rally, okay? And as long as you're entering the data in and using it as your tracking tool, which we'll show you later this morning, these metrics will be automatically created for you. All right, so let's explain first of all what this graph is, just the information in it. So on the y-axis here, you have your velocity, your number of story points you're delivering. On the x-axis, each one of these bars represent one iteration. Okay? So in this iteration, my team delivered roughly 110 story points. Okay? The dark green means you committed to the user story in that iteration, and you got acceptance of that user story in that iteration. Okay? So this dark green, I committed to it in the iteration of August 26th, and it got accepted before August 26th. The light green is I committed to it in that iteration, but I didn't get acceptance on it until after that iteration ended. So this light green here was accepted at some point over here. We don't necessarily know where by this graph, but it was accepted after September 9th. Okay? The red on the graph is indicative of a user story that you committed to in that iteration, and as of the time that I pulled this chart, this metric, it still was not accepted. Okay? And I pulled this on, essentially, I know it ends on December 30th. I pulled it on January 3rd when I got back from work and I hadn't updated or changed anything. So you can see that there is still red all the way back a couple of months prior. So those user stories still had not been accepted. Okay? And this line here is just a trend line, trending down. So does everybody understand the graph itself? Okay? All right, so now when you look at this, remember I told you yesterday that the primary goal of a Scrum team is to be predictable. Who thinks my Scrum team is predictable? I have one person who is very hesitant to raise his hand. What does predictable mean to you guys?
Repetitive success.
Consistent, okay.
Velocity is consistent.
Velocity is consistent. Everybody thinks consistent. What does the word predictable mean to us?
You can
Based on the
predict
past,
the
you
future.
can tell what the future will be.
We can tell what the future will be, right? That's what it means to me, right? So can we do a good job of thinking, how many story points would I commit to in the next iteration, right? To me, that's what I think of when I think predictable. Consistent is certainly one way to do that. There are a lot of things that can come up in the real world that would make your velocity go up and down that would be valid. So I'm going to argue that my velocity is actually predictable, even though my graph looks like this. And now I'm going to go through the next 30 minutes almost of explaining it to you, and then we'll see if I can change your mind. So I only had one person raise his hand. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. This trend line is going down, right? Good or bad? I don't know that I'd say good. Better question, why is my trend line going down? Because of the holiday. Exactly, right? So here, you're here at the end of the year. There's nobody working, right? Well, yeah, I'm not going to commit to 110 story points like it's back in August because I got nobody here, right? So my trend line is going down because we're getting towards the holidays, right? It's right over the holidays. And you can see that this iteration that ended on 12:30, my velocity is like, 25 because I had one person here, all right? So that explains the trend line going south. Now I'm going to jump back here to the beginning. In this August iteration, I committed to 110 story points, and it looks like we got acceptance on about 105. So it's not ideal, it's not perfect, but it's not the end of the world that I committed to 110 story points and we delivered over 95% and we got acceptance on over 95%. Right? It's not perfect, but I'm not going to lose sleep over it. Okay? Then we get to, I'm actually going to jump ahead a little bit. Now I'm going to jump to this iteration here. I'm going to ask for real-world things that may have come up. So, I told you guys yesterday that my Scrum team had 3 products in it. One of those products was significantly larger than the other. The product was called ARO, Application Resource Optimizer. For those who don't know what that is, which is probably the majority of us, the application itself is something that you run on your phone in the background, and it'll measure the metrics, it'll measure the resources on your device and see which ones are draining or doing well as an application is running. So that was not a very good explanation. Let's say you're running Angry Birds, right? You're playing Angry Birds. ARO is running in the background, and it's measuring all the resources on the device, and maybe the way you've coded Angry Birds, it's draining your battery faster than it should, right? It's using a bunch of processor speed that maybe is wasted, and it's draining your battery, right? ARO will measure that, give feedback to the developer, and say, you're draining your battery too fast, right? Here are some things you can do to improve the application efficiency. So it's measuring all the resources and providing that feedback. Now it's not just battery, it's doing network speed and GPS tracking and all sorts of different things on the device itself, measuring those resources, okay? So I will tell you that in my team, that product took the majority of the folks on my Scrum team. The other 2 products were smaller. Now, this one here, right, this iteration here has a lot of light green associated with it. Light green is not good, right? We committed to getting something done in that iteration, and we didn't. We didn't get it accepted until after that iteration was over. So on the surface, that looks bad. I will tell you that for ARO, our goal date to deploy to production was October the 7th, which is the end date for this iteration. So what may have happened in the real world that we would have committed to something in that iteration, and we didn't get acceptance on it, knowing that that was right up to the deployment date? What may have happened? Could have been priorities changing. Not necessarily what happened. Huh? Could have been marshmallows. Maybe we committed and we blew it. There were things that we didn't see and we didn't expect, and it caused a delay. That could have happened. That wasn't it either.
The product owner wasn't available to accept it.
Excellent. Product owner may not have been available to accept it, right? Maybe they were busy preparing for deployment or advertising or whatever. That's not what happened in this case either. It's possible.
The prior ones were taken in that iteration.
Say it again.
The previous ones were taken in that iteration.
Absolutely. Maybe we were working a lot on this previous iteration. That didn't happen either. That wasn't it either. Still waiting for the brilliant response.
Code freeze.
Money? What do you mean? We ran out of money? Well, I guess so, but that would be a bad one because you should be aware of that before you got to that point with the metric that I'm going to show you in a few minutes. Requirements changed. All right?
User
Scope changed. Last minute. Okay, so here's what happened in this example. So we had the deployment date of October 7th. That was our goal, deployment date of October 7th. And we got all of our user stories and did everything that they asked us to do on October 7th. Now we had a final demo that we reviewed with all of our key stakeholders, not the product owner, but with the key stakeholders. The product owner was reviewing it with the key stakeholders as well. And the key stakeholders loved it, right? They really liked what it looked like. And they said, okay, we appreciate you doing all this work, but if we could just make a few of these graphical GUI changes, look and feel type changes, we think it would be perfect, and that's how we would want to deploy it. So as a team, we looked at it, we gathered in all of the requests, and we were like, yeah, well, I mean, we can make all these changes. They're actually quite simple. So we had two options. What pure Agile would tell you to do by the book would be we accept all the user stories that we had in that iteration. The product owner goes out there and creates all new user stories. We ensure we understand those user stories and they're well formed. We size those user stories. We break them down into tasks. We commit to those user stories. And then we go through and we handle them business as usual. That's what pure Agile would tell you to do. That's what we talked about yesterday, right? So we looked at that as a team and said, well, we could go through that process. We could do that. But these are really small changes that aren't going to take very long. And instead of doing that, we simply added a task to user stories that were already created. Those user stories carried on into the next iteration, and within a few days of the next iteration, we knocked all of those out, got acceptance on them, and we actually deployed this product more like October the 11th or 12th or something. And the product owner actually really liked that, right? Was really happy that we could accommodate that. So our date shifted out a few days, but the product owner couldn't have been happier that we were able to accommodate that. Okay? So that light green, when you understand the story behind it, it's actually a good story, even though the metric doesn't look good. Right? That's the danger of putting this metric in front of leadership and just saying, here you go, interpret it however you want. Right? All right, so let's then go back to this one. So I delivered 105 story points here. And then I only let my team commit to 80. Why, if my team had just gotten acceptance of 105, would I only let my team in the next iteration commit to 80? And not only that, they only delivered 60.
Labor Day.
Lessons learned.
Labor Day is close. Lessons learned.
Back to school.
Back to school. Nobody on my team is actually still in school.
Based on what was delivered in the previous iteration.
Could have potentially been churned, but actually the answer is easier than that. Somebody went on vacation. So what we would have told you yesterday is ideally every person on the Scrum team is equally as good. They're all equally proficient. Everybody can step out and help each other. If somebody goes on vacation, the Scrum team doesn't miss a beat. We all know in reality that's not the case. And in that iteration there, the best person on my team, the top architect, went on vacation. And you can see the kind of impact that can have on your team. So I knew him leaving was going to have an impact. I just didn't know exactly how much. So I knew we had delivered 105 story points. I only let my team commit to 80 because he was going on vacation. And then we only delivered 60. We only got acceptance on 60. So I actually was still too high, right? I let them commit to more than I should have. Mm-hmm. So now these 20 story points carry over into the next iteration. But then he gets back in the office, and I can look at this and go, okay, well, we had 20 story points carry over. Now I get my top person back, and I have a full staff. I was like, and I let my team commit to 100 story points. So this is a little bit of a trickier question. Now this is real life. So it's not just black and white where I say, oh, well, we got acceptance on 60 story points last time, so I'm only going to let you commit to 60. Right? You're trying to get to the right number as a team. You want to be right. You don't want to be high and you don't want to be low. You want to be right. So I let my team commit to 100 story points the next iteration. What does that tell us about the 20 story points that are carrying over? Right, we have close to, well, it's 120 story points, it's not part. So it's 20 additional plus the 100 we're committing to. Because you can't just move them over once you've committed to them. Once you've committed to them for an iteration, they stay in that iteration unless for some reason they change. Right, and then they potentially become a new user story or something. So that was a good question. I'm going to get back to my other question. So I let my team commit to 100, knowing that with a full staff operating at full effectiveness, we get acceptance in an iteration of 105 story points. Knowing that we had 20 carryover from the previous iteration, and potentially 5 from the iteration before that, but those were probably already handled. What does that mean about those 20 from that previous iteration? They were reprioritized. Well, they were prioritized to keep. I'll hit that in 1 second. That's a good point. Huh?
They had marshmallows.
They had marshmallows, maybe.
They just needed to go through the acceptance part of it, which is very small.
Excellent. Those 20 story points were mostly done. They probably had already been developed. They maybe had been already majoritively tested. There was only a little work left to do. Otherwise, as a Scrum Master, I would look there and go, well, we got 20 story points carrying over from last iteration. We can do about 105 if we're operating in full force. I would only let my team commit to 85, right? The fact that I let them commit to 100, to me, means those were mostly done, right? So that's the real-life information you need to know in order to be effective in how much you should be able to commit to for an iteration. So I let them commit to 100, and they didn't deliver 100, so I was wrong. I let them commit to too much. You have a question?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of known variability, because even though you develop most of them, they're like, you know what, this is great, but we're going to accept half up because we have changes for the other half. So that's just gaining experience over time with your users, right?
Yeah. The other thing that can really impact this is defects that may come up, right? You think you're going to get this done, all of a sudden a defect comes up, and you can't get acceptance on it, and it causes carryover, right?
As you're going through the process, how do you keep sight of these out-of-office situations?
How do you keep sight of out-of-office situations?
Moose.
Well, that's kind of just what you do today. When I knew that my lead architect was on vacation, because obviously I did because I only committed to a much smaller velocity, so.
Well, yeah, but in traditional waterfall, it's not that big of an issue. You have your ebbs and flows, but in this, where you're really constrained with it as you're going through your iteration, it's a bigger impact than it would be in a waterfall for someone to be up for.
So that comment actually makes me a little bit nervous. Because the reason it's not as big an impact in a waterfall world is because you're under this assumption that you have so long to do something that, well, if somebody goes on vacation, we just won't work for those 2 weeks, right?
We're under the assumption we still have to do it even when they're on vacation, because that's how it works, right?
And see, in my experience, this is the part that makes me nervous, with the way we're set up with SMEs, and this is particularly bad in the enterprise space, they don't, right? There's one person that knows that, there's one SME, then there's other people that maybe slightly know it, right? And then somebody goes on vacation, and honestly, work can't get done until that person gets back.
But but normally when you go on vacation, you work around it on a timeline. So not necessarily it's always just stop work, because you have a timeline normally early on in the waterfall process. So you work around, when somebody's going to be out, you kind of work those dates. So not necessarily do you stop work.
So, and I understand, and what I'm saying here actually with the Agile is you can do exactly what you just mentioned, actually. Mm-hmm. So you have this full scope of work, and you can see my lead architect leaving. The team didn't get no work done. We still got 60 story points accepted of work, right? So all we did was throttled back a little bit based on the person not being here. It's not like some particular piece of the project went into standstill mode because we lost our top person. And that's exactly what you're trying to avoid with an Agile project. You don't want one person to be so critical to a project that if that person leaves, now you're stuck and you can't do anything, right? And I'm not saying that that happens on every waterfall project, because it absolutely doesn't. But the specialization lends itself to that more in a waterfall world than it does in an Agile world where we care more about breadth than we do about SMEs in certain
I know
areas.
what you mean. Yeah, backups.
Okay? All right, so back to this velocity line here. So I let my team commit to 100 story points, and I was wrong, right? Because they only got acceptance on 80. Okay? So maybe we had defects come up because we know we're getting close to this launch date that we want to make sure that we're hitting. Could have been a variety of things. Could have been churn in the requirements. Could have been a lot of things. Okay? But the bottom line is, in this iteration, I know that we caught up on all of that because we still hit that October deployment date that I mentioned, right? All right, so then we go here, and all of a sudden our velocity shoots through the roof. So let me explain a little bit about what happened there. So after we had our initial deployment for that ARO product on October the 11th or 12th or whatever, a lot of our senior leadership got wind of it. Some of our project marketing folks got wind of it, and they wanted to make it the flagship product, the main product in the Consumer Electronics Show, or the AT&T Dev Summit in Vegas, all the way back, not this January, but last January. So there was a lot of work that they wanted to do to make it get it ready for that conference, to make it ready to show out to the rest of the world. And I believe it was at that point that we announced that we were going to make it open source and not charge for it, and make it part of our developers program so that other folks who are using AT&T products and services would get this free of charge to help them build better mobile applications, get them off the ground in the mobile space. Okay? So we were going to put this in the Consumer Electronics Show, go through, review it. They had a lot of bells and whistles they wanted to add before we got to that. So our product owner came to us and said, okay, we have all of these requirements, all of these expectations from all of our key stakeholders. He's like, I know that this is more work than we've been doing. Is there any way that we can do this? Right? Any way that we can get this work done? So now I'm going to flip back to how our Scrum team is set up. Most Scrum teams, just like my Scrum teams, are product-based Scrum teams. My Scrum team owned 3 products. We're responsible for the delivery of 3 products. Based on the space that we're in, there's always emerging technologies. So we found it necessary to have one Scrum team that was considerably smaller, 4 or 5 people, set up to learn the new technologies as they were coming out. And then once they became proficient in those technologies, we popped them out of what we called a skill factory Scrum team. We popped them out of the skill factory, and we put them in the product-based Scrum teams. And then they could go and they could train everybody else in that product-based Scrum team. Okay? So it was necessary for us to have the skill factory Scrum team. For example, 2 years ago, HTML5 was just brand new, right? We recognized the fact that HTML5 is probably going to be pretty valuable to know, and in 6 months, there's going to be a lot more web-based work that could now be on mobile through HTML5. So we created this Skill Factory Scrum team and said, you're going to focus on HTML5 work, and then they would take user stories from all of the Scrum teams that were related to HTML5 work so that they could learn that skill as quickly as possible. Okay? So they weren't responsible in owning a product. Instead, they were responsible for ramping up on HTML5, or a new skill. Then 6 months down the road, they have all this experience with HTML5. We can take those 5 people, pop them off, put them into 5 different product-based Scrum teams, and they can ramp up everybody else. Okay, make sense? That's the purpose of that team. So now I look at this work that comes in, all of this additional work. And I do an evaluation on it, and I was like, okay, somehow I need to increase my velocity. I was like, okay, does any of this work map to what that Skill Factory Scrum team is trying to learn? And it did. So I took all of that work that the Skill Factory Scrum team was trying to do, and all of the work that mapped to what my product owner had asked for additional work that came in, and I gave them all of that work. right? So I used 2 additional people from that skill factory team, and you can see it made our velocity go up. I was able to commit to more work. Did that make sense? Now that is a more complicated concept, right? Because I've already mentioned a bunch of things of, you know, your scrum team shouldn't change. You're trying to keep your scrum team consistent. You don't want to have product bridging over and overlap into other teams, right? All of those things are very good principles, and we do try to maintain that in our space, but we have to balance that with the necessity of the fact that we need to ramp up on new skills all the time. And we need to figure out how we're going to do that. So the Skill Factory Scrum Team folks don't actually report to my Scrum team, but they are still responsible for learning a skill which I can tap into if I have an increased workload. So I can use them essentially to handle some of the overflow work if my team's capacity gets higher than we can handle. Yeah?
So to do this, to accomplish this transfer of work, did you give them tasks that had been defined through the user stories, or did you give them user stories?
Gave them user stories. And then they created their own tasks.
That's what I mean.
So you can see that when I used those 2 people from that Skill Factory Scrum team, our velocity went up to 155. But not only that, remember for the first couple of days of this iteration, we were doing this stuff, these small changes, right? So when I look at this next iteration, I was like, well, heck, we committed to 155 story points there and got them all accepted, 100% acceptance. And we did some work over here. At the beginning, I was like, clearly in the next iteration, we can commit to more work, right? So I let the team commit to 160 or 65, and I was wrong, right? So you can see that a new team here, just gelling, using people that may not be completely familiar with working with each other, you have more flux in how many story points you're going to knock out each iteration, right? So we committed to 165-ish, and we only got acceptance on 150. Not terrible, but we got acceptance on 150, okay? Now there's a little sliver of red here that's still red 2 months later. What do we think that is? Yeah?
Product owner is rejecting some requirements, or they feel that this is not important now?
Scope change?
Scope change.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
I think you guys all said the same thing. That's exactly what happened there, right? So we're in a very big hurry, right? They're trying to target the November, so we only had 1 month to turn around all of these new requests that they had. So they have all this change, all these new things that they want. We're trying to operate really fast. They asked us to do something, and then as we're iterating within the iteration, they decided, no, I know we told you to do that, but it turns out we don't want that anymore, right? So in an Agile world, any change that happens within an iteration we consider churn. Churn is bad, right? So you commit to an iteration, and that iteration should not change. If they do want to change, then it would happen the next iteration, right? The one exception to that is if you're working on something and they no longer need it anymore, well, don't waste your time doing something that's going to be completely irrelevant, right? You just kind of forget about it, handle it later in terms of cleaning it up, closing it out, whatever you need to do, depending on if you've worked on it or not yet. And we'll get to that in the next chart. But the idea being, you don't want to waste your time doing something that's not going to add value, right? And in this case, they asked us to do something, and then within the middle of the iteration, they said we don't need it anymore, and it's no longer going to add value, right? So we just stopped working on it. Okay? Now, we get to the next iteration, and those 2 people ramp off because we had delivered the expected value that they wanted, the additional increased scope, right? We essentially fit 3 iterations into 2 of work, right? Because now we're delivering 150, 160 story points instead of 105. So now the next iteration comes, and I go, you know what? My team's been doing a pretty good job over these last couple of iterations. It seems as though they're a lot more effective. So even though those 2 people rolled off from the Skill Factory Scrum team, I let my team commit to almost 120 story points. And I was wrong, right? So you can see that they only got delivery, they only got acceptance back on 110. Right back at the line that they were at before all of this started, right?
Okay.
They got acceptance back to 110.
Okay.
All right, then we go into this.
So what happens when you do that? When you accept 120
So that's a good question. So most of the time, right, the vast majority of the time, that work is probably going to carry over into the next iteration, right? Because if it's priority for this iteration and the top priority for this iteration, when you go to next iteration, now they can reprioritize everything they want, right? But practically, the majority of the time, if it was high priority last iteration, it's still going to be high priority next iteration. However, remember the example I gave you yesterday with Instagram? If we were working on Locker, and we had that red, and then Instagram came out, and marketing was like, I don't care what you were working on before, now you're working on automatic upload to the cloud. We as a team don't get to say, oh, well, I was 95% done with this, let me just finish it out. No. If it's not priority, you don't get to work on it. So the danger in not getting acceptance of something within an iteration is it could manifest itself in waste if it doesn't get prioritized for the next iteration. Now, the majority of the time it does, but it doesn't 100% of the time. And that's the danger of not getting acceptance of something within that iteration. Make sense? That was a great question. All right.
It doesn't become an issue that you committed to it and it didn't get done.
Yeah, it can absolutely become an issue if you've committed to it and it doesn't get done. Yes. Yeah, big issue. Because if you're not allowed to work on it anymore, that's wasted time and wasted money. And then, ultimately, if it changes, right, then that's another problem that adds on top of it. Because now you need to go back and figure it out or whatever. So it's additional work.
But the red doesn't signify the work is not done. Red signifies it's not accepted.
Red signifies it's not accepted. Not accepted means it's not done.
But we're not deploying if it doesn't get accepted.
Yeah, it's not going to deploy if it's not accepted.
Isn't it the client's choice or the product owner's choice to, when you commit to 120, they chose not to accept those 10, right?
Well, they chose not to accept the 110, but I'm sure they weren't going, oh, well, you did all the work, and I'm just not going to accept it because I'm a jerk. Usually, that's not what they do.
But, I mean, that doesn't reflect on your committing to the 120.
No, this is saying I committed to 120, and we did not meet our commitment by roughly 10 story points.
Whether we're able to control it or not.
Rather, yeah, whatever. It could be a bunch of different reasons, but the bottom line is I didn't get acceptance on 10 story points, which probably means that I'm still testing them or maybe even still developing them, but for some reason they didn't get acceptance. Probably not because the product owner just didn't want to accept them for whatever reason, right? Because there's a good relationship there. If the work was done and should be accepted, they would have accepted it.
I was trying to figure out why it wasn't light green.
Why is it not light green? Because as of the time I pulled this report on January 3rd, it still hadn't been accepted. It was still open.
So if you'd gotten to it like next month or something, it would have been light green, not red.
Red turns into light green once that work gets accepted. Yep. Okay, yeah?
I have a question, it's slightly different from this. In the Agile world, there is 2 weeks of iteration duration. Now, we are talking about de-scoping and last-minute scope additions, right? Like, for example, the internet, Instagram, whatever
Instagram.
we were talking about. Now, does it mean that we will end up with many CRs? Because even if you de-scope any requirement, then you end up with a CR. Because if you add a scope, then you end up with a CR. So with this 2 weeks of iteration duration, are we going to have more CRs?
I can tell you, in all the time I did Agile, I never had a single CR. Not one.
See, look out for if you de-scope,
Right.
you have to open
Love
a CR.
Agile.
No. So yesterday, remember, and Jake will talk about this a little bit this afternoon. Remember, we're baselining at our M3 milestone at a high enough level that allows us the flexibility of making these changes as we iterate. And Jake will talk about that later this afternoon.
You're just taking things off the scope to ensure there's no scope increase in requirements here.
There's still scope change in terms of they want this additional piece of functionality or whatever. But if you think about the business case for the ARO tool, the idea was we're going to create this application that's monitoring resources so that we can use it as a marketing tool out there to promote active participation in our application developers program at AT&T. We're still meeting that business case, right? Regardless of what gets added in here from a requirements perspective or what different functionality we're doing, we're still meeting that business case. So we baseline our epics at that level which gives us the flexibility to change as we deliver the actual tool.
Where did you get the funding for the two additional people?
Where did we get it? We'll talk about that later. That's more complicated.
Okay, so, in AT&T, you would have to have, your project level documentation needs ACR. But in Agile, when we're talking user stories, as long as you're not changing minds, you don't have to have, you're not requiring.
Right, you're not requiring a
So
CR.
that's, I think, when we would do that.
Yep. So we're going to get to CRs. I don't want to get into a discussion about the CRs. Jake will talk about CRs right after lunch. You guys can talk about CRs for 2 hours. All right. Huh?
How long do you track your not acceptance?
How long do you track your non-acceptance? You track non-accepted forever until it's either no longer valuable and you just need to get rid of it and close it out, or you get acceptance on it. Right?
So if they say, hey, don't work on this anymore, you're taking it completely off.
Yeah, if it's no longer valuable, then you just take it off the chart.
Even though you may have burned that.
Well, there's a catch to that. So if you've already worked on it, we'll hit that on the next chart that you'll see right after this. All right, let me finish this chart real quick. All right, so now we go into this phase that's essentially a total mess, right? Our velocity goes from 110 down to, we committed to 70, and we only got acceptance on 30, and this is a mess. Now, I've actually mentioned this a couple of times, so somebody may have a chance, other than the people who actually know me. What happened there? What happened here and here?
You had a bit.
Who said that? Yeah, that's what happened. I had a baby. Well, not me. My wife had a baby. Right? So I left. Scrum Master left basically right around that time of 12/2. And I left in a little bit of a hurry. Wasn't really caring at all about my metrics at the time and what they looked like and what we had committed to. Right? And I asked somebody to take it over, but clearly my team was not particularly cross-functional because the product owner delegate that I asked to step in did a horrible job of managing what we should commit to and how much we were getting done and who was accepting it and making sure that everybody was doing what they were supposed to do. Didn't do it. So clearly, you can see how important I am by this metric. Just put that right on my A&D and all my problems are solved. Right? So, in reality, you want to be cross-functional, right? You're trying to do that as much as you can. You're trying to maximize on that. But that's not easy to do. And you can see from the graph that sometimes when other people step in, they're not going to do as good a job as whoever the primary person is who does that day in and day out. So we're constantly striving to be cross-functional. Obviously, when I looked at this when I came back, I spent a little bit more time explaining what I do day in and day out to our product owner or product owner delegate so that if I went on vacation again, they could step in and perhaps we wouldn't see these kinds of dips, right? But obviously, that churn represents itself in these metrics, and I honestly don't know what happened in those couple of weeks because that obviously wasn't my primary concern, okay? So now let me ask you guys a question. It is the middle of February, and I have my whole team there, right? How many story points should my team commit to?
100.
100.
100.
110? I heard 105?
100.
100? To me, that sounds pretty predictable, right? 100 to 115 sounds pretty predictable to me. And that's why I would say that even though my graph looks like this, based on the real-world stuff that we had to deal with, I think my team is pretty predictable. What would I commit to if my top architect went away on vacation?
80.
60%. 60, 40.
60, 70, yeah.
Yeah.
Right? So you have some direction, you have some information you can tap into to let you be predictable in certain situations when things come up. And that's what you're driving towards, predictability. Right? Make sense?
Yes.
Cool. All right, let's move on to the next metric. So this is the ideal sprint burn down. Yes?
What if you commit to something and get cheap architect is not the time?
What happens if he gets hit by a bus and you didn't see it coming? I used that example not long ago and somebody had actually been hit by a bus. So, yeah, I know. I felt like a jerk. But then it's like, come on, I say that all the time. Why you gotta call me out like that? So if that happens, I mean, that's gonna mess up anything. You know, real world stuff like that happens, and it's gonna mess you up, right? You lose your top person completely unexpectedly. That's gonna mess you up, but it's gonna mess you up no matter what delivery methodology you're using.
Right.
Question on that is, why would you look to the product owner versus someone in the Scrum team to step up?
To step up and be the Scrum Master. Why did I pick the product owner?
And will you do it again?
Yeah, would I do it again? I might look for somebody else next time. So I kind of asked them. So like in our stand-up, I said, I'm going to be going out, having a baby. I know it's coming, right? I'm going to need somebody to step up while I'm away who would like to be Scrum Master for a few weeks. Product owner delegate. Basically, everybody sat there quiet for a few minutes. And then finally, the product owner delegate said, I'll do it. And then I was like, okay, great, thanks. That's basically how it went. Okay? No, I wouldn't have pulled somebody from that skill factory team because they weren't focused on being Scrum Masters. They were focused on HTML5 skills and server-side development type skills too. Dojos and things like that. Yeah?
The non-accepted user stories, does it have to be cleaned up so that actually what stage you have?
If you went back and you looked at my metrics today, all of this would be cleaned up. So you just clean it up when it's appropriate to clean it up. I would go back and clean it up every iteration. I would go through and look at it and make sure it was accurate. So it's kind of an ongoing cleanup effort. I mean, it doesn't take long. You know what that stuff is. I can hover over those things when you actually look at it in Rally, and it'll tell me the exact user story that it is and what it is, and I'll know, is that still relevant or is it not relevant?
Is there somewhere in the software to work all of these things and have user iterations for when leadership wants to look back at it, or is this just your memory?
Where you can store the story, essentially? No. No, that's all in our heads. If you want to write it down, you can, but I never wrote it down. I mean, I guess the issue is you know what's going on because this is your life. This is what you do day in and day out, right? 8 hours a day, I'm doing this stuff. Not caring about the metrics, but I'm caring about the delivery. I know what's going on with the project. So when I see the metric, I know what caused it.
But if someone else pulls your report or your leadership does, they're not going to.
No, it's totally useless to them. Yeah. It's only valuable to me and my Scrum team, which I used in my retrospective to figure out how much we should commit to, how our changes impacting the team, a whole variety of things.
Yeah, those things might come out in retrospective and then you document it that way.
Yeah.
Kind of lessons learned, if you want to.
That's true.
Put them down somewhere.
So in Agile, are the metrics sent to leadership? You don't send them to them?
Not these ones.
Okay.
And if I do, like sometimes I did review this stuff with our leadership, but it was with the leadership figure that knew Agile, right?
So
And
if you
so when
send
I
them, you
put
have to
this in front of
explain
them, I would explain it and you would get it.
Okay.
All right, let's keep going. All right, so now we have
explanation behind your...
Yeah, all our user stories are stored in Rally. All of them are stored in Rally. And even some that we may not get to or do could exist in the backlog for as long as you want, and it's up to you to clean that stuff up.
And how do you get home for the budgeting and all of that? Because at that time it could be... That's a joke.
So Jake will talk a little bit about, but remember we talked about budgeting a lot yesterday, and there's another budget burned out graph here in a few minutes. All right, so this is the ideal sprint burned out, right? You know exactly how much work you're committing to, you knock out a little bit of that work every single day. This is irrelevant, this is not going to happen. All right, this is a real budget burned out, or I'm sorry, a real iteration burned out chart, okay? So, let me explain it. On this y-axis, we have the number of task hours left to do. So when you create a user story, then individuals create tasks to that user story, and they estimate how many hours it's going to take them to do that task. The total summation of all of those task hours for that iteration of all the individuals on the Scrum team left to do is this blue line. All right, this blue bar. It's task hours left to do. So if on Wednesday I've already worked 4 hours out of the 8 that I thought that it was going to take to do this task, the task hours left to do is now 4, right? On this other y-axis, we have the number of story points delivered, and those are the green bars. Each bar here, or set of bars, is a day. And this whole chart represents one iteration. Okay? So if you look at this, we delivered 340 hours worth of tasks. Okay? And we committed to 78 story points in this iteration, which was May of like 2 years ago. What is today? Yeah, like a year and 8 months ago. Okay? So, my first question to you guys is on the first day, day 1 of the iteration, we only had 50 hours worth of tasks broken down out of the 340 hours worth of tasks that we ultimately delivered. Good or bad? Not so good. Not so good. Because really what that means to me, right, we only had 50 hours worth of tasks out of the 340 that we ultimately delivered. We had only broken down roughly 1/7 of the scope of the user stories that we committed to delivering in that iteration. You're really leaving yourself open to hitting marshmallows when you've only broken down 1/7 of your overall scope into tasks, right?
Theoretically, that should be all the way up.
Theoretically, that blue line should be all the way up to the top. That would mean that we had broken down all of our scope into tasks on day 1. That's never going to happen, right? Because there's always going to be something that you're going to break down or figure out as you're going through. But ideally, you want that blue line to be as high as possible. Okay? Make sense? So now as we deliver, right? And I'm going to try to make this easy. So we had 350 total hours of tasks. So every day, you would assume, if we're doing it by the average, we're doing 35 hours worth of task work per day, right? So I had 50 that I had already known, but I got 35 done, so that would take me down to 15, 50 minus 35. But then on day 2, we pop back up to 40. That would mean that we added about 25 hours worth of tasks on day 2. But we completed 35, right? So there's a going down with the amount of work we're getting done, and then it's going up with the new tasks that we're adding. Make sense? So same thing happens then on day 3, where from 40 we go down to 5, and then we're up to 80, so we added like 75 hours worth of tasks on day 3. We added maybe another 50 or so hours worth of tasks on day 4. And notice we get our first little bit of acceptance on day 4. Okay? So in our retrospective, when I looked at this graph, remember I told you we used to have our grooming sessions and our planning sessions on the first day of the iteration, which now you can see, all right, we committed to stuff, but we really didn't know what we were committing to. Then we spent the next few days breaking this down and understanding them. We're breaking down more tasks. So when we retrospected on this, I looked at this and said, well, we don't get our first bit of acceptance until day 4. We should move our planning session, our grooming session, back to 3 days before the iteration starts. So this chart would shift back 3 days, at least in my head. Make sense? And that's how I use this information in the retrospective to hopefully drive change and start to get acceptance on day 1 of the iteration. Not only that, but if we're starting to break all this stuff down into tasks, this blue bar on day 1, because now you can see that we've also broken these down, would probably be more like up here. Make sense?
Right.
Yeah.
When you moved it back 3 days, thinking in terms of the team resources, were the resources engaged in breaking down the tasks? Were those resources now doing double duty to finish up the iteration that you're just finishing? They're 3 days
Yeah, they're doing both
from
things.
the end.
Yep. So they're still working on user stories and tasks from that current iteration while they're breaking down tasks for the next. Yeah, they're doing both. But keep in mind, it's not a huge leap. It's not like they're doing, You know, they have to turn off the brain on this side and turn it on this side. The work is all very much so, really it's the same problems, right? So, it's not a big deal, I guess, at least in my experience. All right, so then you can see, we get to halfway through the iteration, we start to get some acceptance, and now we've stopped adding tasks, right? But now we have everything pretty much fully broken down by halfway through the iteration, and now we really just start to follow the trend line, right? Now we follow the trend line. So now you can see we get a little bit of acceptance here. We're starting to get acceptance. Now, one of the main points of this graph that you're trying to figure out is your team delivering iteratively? Okay? When you look at this chart, by a raise of hands, who thinks that my team is delivering work iteratively? Why?
Because as the development is done, the testing is happening after that, and then acceptance are coming after that. So it looks like a gradual process rather than parallel.
The ones that are done properly, that goes down.
Okay? I think you guys are right. So I would say that I'm delivering work iteratively here. I'm delivering my scope iteratively because I'm getting a little bit of acceptance every single day. If this was waterfall, you'd have no acceptance, no acceptance, no acceptance, boom, a ton of acceptance. Right? And all of your acceptance would be happening at the very end. If you're delivering iteratively, you're getting a little bit of acceptance every single day. So when I look at this, I'm like, okay, maybe we didn't maximize on our ability to start getting acceptance up front here, but we're certainly doing a pretty good job of breaking down our work into small pieces and delivering it iteratively and so on and so forth. Okay? Yep.
I feel like you're probably going to tell me we'll talk about this later, but do you have examples of what that, how you do that? Because it's very difficult to try to figure out how you would deliver things at that level, given what at least mine does. So maybe some examples of what you're delivering that iteratively, you know?
So the goal, the only way you can deliver things and get acceptance on things every day like that is by breaking them down into small pieces. So you need to break the functionality down into small pieces. So
Right,
maybe...
that's why I'm asking for an example. I guess
Right.
it's supposed to be, but
I'll
I'm trying to
give
figure
you-
out an example of that.
So like, let's say, for example, you need to create a save screen, right? You need to be able to save a file. You could create a user story that just says, you know, as a user of this application, I need to be able to save a file. And here's what I want in my save screen, right? So you create the entire save screen and all the functionality associated with the save screen and where you're going to put that file and everything with that. Or you could take each piece of that and say, well, here's a button that I want on my save screen. Here's where you're going to save the file. Here's how the file will be structured. Each one of those could potentially be a different user story. Now, so there's two ways to look at this. So if you're confident that you can just make the whole save, all the save functionality and make that one user story, and you're confident you're going to be able to deliver on it, okay, fine, maybe you create one user story for that. The danger being, if you make it 95% of the way through that user story, and it's a 13-point story, and you don't finish, you get 0. Right? Whereas if you broke that down into 13 one-point stories, well, you could still get acceptance on the 12, and you just didn't get acceptance on the 1. So it's up to you guys as Scrum Masters to determine at what level you're going to make those user stories to minimize your risk of, I got 95% of the way through and didn't get acceptance on it, and now I'm stuck. Okay?
For this iterative model, so Scrum Master can go to the product owner to say that instead of having the higher level of milestone, we can break down so that we can have acceptance each day.
Right. So that you can get something accepted each day. You're going to break those down, and that's exact feedback that you give to your product owner. Now, actual application-specific stuff for whatever your team is, we'll talk about on Thursday afternoon. You can talk about in that session, what are good user stories for my team? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just having a really hard time trying to apply it. That's the only reason I'm asking the question, because I'm trying to understand how some of those things you accept that if you don't have the whole thing, right? So so each piece has to be something they can also test and accept independently, no matter how many pieces you break it into, right?
Yeah. Yep. So everything they should be able to test and accept. So in the case of the button, right, let's say you're just making a button, they can go out there and they can see the button, and they can make sure it works, and maybe there's functionality where if you click it, a window pops up or something, but you're trying to isolate particular little pieces of functionality. Okay? Yeah? You do. We'll get to that. Yes. All right, so let's get back to the burn down. So, I'm going to miss that long shot. All right, so back to this. So we're delivering the work iteratively. However, we only got acceptance on 52 story points out of 78 total. That's not good, right? That's not good. However, when I look at this, we only have about 20 hours worth of tasks still remaining. Okay? So now I can tell you, because I did a lot of analysis on my team back then, that we were delivering, it was taking us roughly 10 hours, everybody involved, to deliver one story point, get acceptance on one story point. It was about 10 hours. So when I look at this and I see, well, we have 25 story points still to get accepted, but only 20 hours worth of tasks still remaining, what does that mean to me?
Over budget.
Over budget, man.
It can be done in that.
You didn't forecast it
We
right.
couldn't deliver 78, we didn't deliver 78, but I think we're close over here that they're almost done, right? They're almost there. So maybe we did a little bit of a bad job not breaking down our user stories small enough for some of these, but these are almost done, okay? So we got acceptance on 52, and I know that we're majoritively through the remaining 25. So question to you guys, how many story points, pretend you're all Scrum Masters, how many story points would you let your Scrum team, if this was your Scrum team, commit to in the next iteration?
50?
So, right? So we have 20 hours worth of work that's probably going to carry over, right? 20 hours worth of work that's probably going to carry over. Last time I committed to 78 story points. That's too high, right? I have 20 hours worth of work that's carrying over. So I'm going to drop down that 78 to maybe 70. 70 is probably what we would have gotten acceptance on had we structured this right, is my guess. On top of that, we have 20 hours worth of work carrying over. Maybe that's another 5 story points. So if I'm thinking about what I'm going to let my team commit to in the next iteration, maybe 65, somewhere in that range. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I cannot get my head around a Scrum Master, being able to estimate the number of stories.
It's because it's not black and white. It's not easy to estimate the number of story points that the team is trying to commit to. The difficulty here, and what we're used to, is let's be safe, right? Oh, well, we delivered 50 last iteration, and we have some carryover. I'm only going to let my team commit to 40. That way I can make sure that we get acceptance on all 40. It's not, the goal of a Scrum Master is not to play it safe. The goal is to get it right, right? The goal is to commit to the right number. It's just as bad to be way low as it is to be way high.
So, maybe I should wait.
The answer is it's for how do you commit to the right number of story points? It's just experience and getting familiar with your team. At the beginning, you're going to be way wrong, almost for certain, right? Yeah. But you get experience, and you can tap into that experience to try to get to what you think the right number is. Okay. All right, and it will change with time too. What you commit to in June may not be what you commit to in December. As you learn more, potentially your team changes or whatever. Okay, yeah.
It's not an obvious question, but the acceptance points, are those cumulative or those independent?
No, these are cumulative. Yeah, that's a good question for this graph. All right, so let's move down to story burn-up. Okay. All right, so let me explain. So this is for one particular product. So this may be more of a product burn-up. And the product is AOTS for iPad. Okay, we created an application for iPad for tickets and stuff for technicians. All right, so on the y-axis here, we have the number of story points accepted. In each one of these lines here, these dates is a week. Now keep in mind our iterations are 2 weeks, so every 2 of them is another iteration. This black line here is representative of the number of story points that are in the backlog. And these red lines are our release dates, our release time box. Remember? Okay? So my first question for you on this graph is, how much do we know about this product when we first started working on it?
Doesn't look like
Very little, right? We committed to doing it, we knew very little. So let's talk about this up front. We don't do much work here, okay? Agile has this concept of an iteration 0 or sprint 0. Now, I'm not in love with the name because it's a little bit of a misnomer. In the fact that I don't care how long your iteration 0 is. It can be as long as you need. The bottom line is that in your iteration 0, you're doing all the work you need to do so that when you get to iteration 1, you can actually start delivering something. So if you need to configure your environment, if you need to get tools, if you need to make sure everybody understands the user stories, or make sure that user stories are well formed, or whatever it is you need to do so that when you get to the first iteration, you can actually start working and doing stuff, that's your iteration 0 period. And I don't necessarily care how long your iteration 0 period is. It doesn't need to be as long or as short as your other iterations. Ideally, it's as short as possible, right? You want to reduce that time because it's overhead and just whatever it takes to get started, right? So you want that period as short as possible, but you also want to make sure that when you get to the first iteration, everybody doesn't turn and look at each other and go, okay, where do we start, right? So you need that period of time to figure everything out so that when you get to iteration 1, you get started. So you can see at the beginning here, right, we're not really knocking out any user stories. That's our iteration 0 period for this project. Make sense? All right, then we start to knock stuff out, and then we hit a lull. What happened? What may have happened here where we hit a lull? We didn't get any user stories accepted for a month.
Your work was reprioritized?
Yeah, was reprioritized. In layman's terms, that project went on hold. This project went on hold for a month because, so like I mentioned, my team had 3 products in it. All of a sudden, one product became really, really super important and got a lot of visibility. So I had to go back and talk to this client and say, I really need to focus my people over here for a little while, but I promise we'll get back to you and we'll still hit your dates. Right? So for a while, this project went on hold. Sometimes that can be a hard conversation to have with a product owner, but in this case, we had a good relationship with them. They were okay with it. They understood. And we moved over and focused on that other product for a while. Okay, then we get back and we start doing work. Are we delivering iteratively here? Yeah, we are. However, this is the only time I've ever seen this happen. Here you can see we get acceptance on something, and then the acceptance dips down. Right? So we get unaccepted, which I've only seen happen once. But what may have caused something to get unaccepted?
Scope change.
Scope change. I mean, user story changed.
After the release.
User story changed would result in a new user story.
Oh,
so
okay.
that wouldn't be something here. So scope change is an end.
How about code was deployed, but then
Code was deployed and backed out? Nope, that wouldn't result in unacceptance.
not developed as per the design?
Not developed as per the design is getting close.
Defects?
Defects? Nope, not defects. So here's what happened there. This is a very tricky question. So this happened only because my product owner and the product owner delegate were not on the same page. So now the product owner delegate has gone out and accepted something, shows it to the product owner, and the product owner goes, whoa, that is not what I meant. That is not it. That's not what I wanted, right? And now the product owner delegate has to come back to the team and go, sorry, I misinterpreted what the product owner wanted. I have to change it. I have to pull that back. Here's what he wants. Now let's go and do that thing. Okay? That's really the only time I've ever seen where something would get unaccepted is if the product owner and the product owner delegate are not on the same page. Otherwise, if there's a scope change, if there's something new, if there's a defect, right, we're going to track that through either a new user story that may have story points, may not have story points, but it's not going to result in something getting unaccepted.
When you say a new user story, are you saying the original user story is modified to become new?
No.
Okay, so the original user story is not accepted, or, yeah, it's not accepted. So does it go red?
We're going to,
Does that have a new one?
Carolyn will talk about that in like an hour.
Thank you.
Okay? All right, so let's get back to this. Okay, so now we're delivering. Now we hit another lull. This is tricky, so I'm just going to explain what this one is. So there's a term in an Agile world called spiking. Spiking is essentially when any team has to get together to either do some sort of solutioning. Oh, it lasted so long. Finally, the marshmallow tower has fallen over. So spiking is a term where the Scrum team gets together to solution something. It could be a problem, it could be just brainstorming any potential new item, but the team is getting together to problem solve. So I'll give you a good example. So I explained that ARO product and what it did, right? And it's monitoring all the resources on the device. When we first came up with a solution for ARO, the solution required us to root the device, jailbreak the device. Basically, it means you get access to root information, right? So that because a lot of the resource information is stored at the root level, okay? So we presented the solution over to our client. We showed them. They're like, well, it's great that we can do this, but if you're going to make it so that we have to root every device in order for this to work, they're like, I don't think that's applicable. And they're like, I'm pretty sure it's not even legal. They're like, I don't think that that's a valid alternative for us. So unless there's a plan B, this project is dead, right? So for a period of time, of a week, our team did nothing but brainstorm and do research on what are potential solutions to that problem. Because if I don't find it, this project is dead. So we went out and we found a couple of potential solutions. We presented both those solutions back to the client. The client actually liked both of them, and then they became user stories that we implemented and the project got to go on. Okay? But this period of spiking, you don't really assign, I didn't assign story points to it because, well, you don't really know how much effort, you don't know that you're going to find an answer, right? You're searching for answers. You don't necessarily know how much effort is involved. It's hard to do a comparison. So for a period of time, you're really having no input other than the research into what you're going to do to resolve that problem. So you can see that we didn't really churn out any story points. But then we came up with an answer, we presented it back to them, and we could move on. Make sense?
Yeah.
All right, then we continued to deliver. Did we deliver to the client what they wanted?
Yeah.
Yes. Why?
Because you did it within that.
Green line meets the black line. Did we deliver it when they wanted it?
Well, no, you went
Who thinks
4
no?
weeks old.
Who thinks yes? The answer is you can't tell from this graph. Right? Now, the mistake that most of us make is we're tying release to deployment. When in fact, in our Agile world, that's not it, right? The actual targeted release date of deployment for this application was early June.
Yeah.
So we actually gave it to them earlier than they wanted because we finished all of their user stories by May 25th. But you can't tell by this graph. Okay? All right, any other questions on burnup? Cool, let's move on to defects. So I don't want to talk about defects a lot because we're going to get into a defect discussion later this morning. But this metric is important to me again because it can show whether or not you're doing a good job of breaking up work into small pieces. Okay? So if I talk about this graph real quick, here we just have defect count on the y-axis, a day of the iteration on the x, and this entirely counts, this is just one iteration, right? So blue means I found a defect and I submitted it. Gray means that defect has been fixed. Red means the tester says, I wish you weren't such a liar because it's not fixed. And then green means it's closed, right? They closed it out.